Hi, everyone. I'm Chris of National Parents Organization. Today I'm here with Dr. John Hamel, who's an expert in domestic violence. And this year he gave a presentation at the International Conference on Shared Parenting. And today he's here to talk to us a little bit about his research and about his experience in court with domestic violence.
I supervise anger management and domestic violence programs for people that have been either convicted of domestic violence or accused of domestic violence and referred through the family court. And over the years, having had hundreds of almost exclusively male clients referred to me from the family court for domestic violence offenses, it occurred to me that a lot of these people that referred to me really were either not dangerous at all to their children. The accusations were exaggerated, and or they were married to women that were just as violent or more so than they were.
Okay,
How
I
did I
see.
know this? It's not just wasn't just based on my interviews with these men, because clients can be self-serving, of course. I actually, in the first several years back in the 90s, when I was interviewing family court clients, I also insisted on meeting with the women.
Mm-hmm.
So back in the late 1990s in Contra Costa County, California, which is on the other side of Alameda County, where Berkeley and Oakland are located, white working class area. I over a period of a couple of years, I interviewed about 40 or 50 pairs of parents. Yes, I met with them separately because they were going through divorce, where the woman alleged that the husband was violent and was seeking custody. And what I found was, and this is what the women told me, this is what the mothers told me. What they told me was that they too were, aggressive at times. They too were hitting their husbands. They, in many occasions, were hitting their children.
Wow.
So, and so I talked about that, my findings. I talked about my findings to a local community domestic violence council, for lack of a better term. Most counties in the United States, large counties, have some kind of citizens council
Mm-hmm.
that's supposed to address problems of domestic violence and family violence. And when I presented my findings, all hell broke loose. And I mean, all hell broke loose. Like most of these county organizations are headed by the local battered women shelter, and then a lot of law enforcement people attend those things, and you know dignitaries from the mayor's office and mental health professionals and so forth. But there was a strong reaction to what I had to say, and I knew right then that there's a real serious problem with this system, because what I was saying to them is, look, you're asking me to provide anger management treatment for these guys who you believe are violent and are a threat to the children. I just interviewed these guys, and I've interviewed the wives. And what the wives are telling, never mind the guys, what the wives are telling me is that they have their own anger management problems. They're having trouble dealing with the kids. Sometimes they hit the kids, sometimes they scream at the kids. And also they're violent towards their partners. And furthermore, they seem to be almost flippant about the way they discuss this. In other words, well, I can hit them because I'm a woman. I mean, some of them actually said that. So I'm just telling you, this is how I got started in doing research. Because prior to that, I was just a clinical social worker, very happy to conduct these groups. But it became very apparent to me way back in the 1990s that there was something wrong. I never got referrals for women for anger management women's group, ever.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So when I pointed this out to the at this meeting, when I pointed this out, like, why aren't I getting women to be referred to the anger management program? Their response was to shut down the meeting, and
Wow.
they dissolved the local domestic violence council, because I had a lot of people on my side who were agreeing with me,
Right.
and it created such a schism that rather than continue with this inherent conflict amongst different factions, the powers that be decided to dissolve the local domestic violence council. So this is how I got interested in this topic, and since then I've continued to do groups. Now, most of what I do is forensic work. I testify as an expert witness in criminal as well as family law cases. And along the way, I've been doing a lot of research. I've published many books and articles. I can't say that the family law and domestic violence is my main area of expertise, but it's one of them. It's something I've done a lot of thinking about, done a lot of research on. I don't know if you've read any of my articles. I did about 10 years ago, some colleagues and I did a study where we put together a questionnaire on domestic violence knowledge, and we administered it to mental health professionals, mostly people that worked in the family court system. So we administered this questionnaire, a 10-item quiz on domestic violence facts based on the latest research. We administered the questionnaire to several hundred subjects. We did some of it online, some of it was at an AFCC conference, the AFCC organization in San Francisco back in the 2000s, late 2000s, I believe. So family court mediators, evaluators, attorneys, and judges. And then we had a comparison group of students, first year freshmen, 17 and 18-year-olds at a university. And we found that overall, the average number of correct answers was about 3.5 out of 10.
Mm-hmm.
And what was striking is that the family court professionals did not perform significantly better than the students. So think about that. Family court professionals, licensed clinical social workers, Ph.D.s, clinical psychologists, judges who have the power to decide where children should be living at. All these individuals scored no better, not significantly better than a 17 or 18-year-old college student with no training whatsoever in domestic violence. And the second thing, not only do we find that there's low scores, but more importantly, the low scores were skewed in a direction that belied their gender bias. In other words, these are multiple choice questions. If you look at the study, you'll see what I mean. The questions were asked in such a way that one could say that the frequency of, say, sexual abuse or physical abuse, or who initiates the violence, or what's the motivator, could be in a female direction, a male direction, or somewhere in the middle. And the errors that they made when they were in error was always in the female direction. They always overestimated the amount of violence against women and underestimated the amount of violence against men. So not only it's not that they were guessing. Also, we had out of the in the multiple choice choices, one of them was I don't know. Very few of them said I don't know. Okay, so we show that it wasn't that they didn't know. They thought they knew, and they were wrong in a consistent way. In other words, they were just assuming that domestic violence is something that happens to women. And ever since then, I've pursued this matter. I've done a lot more research on it, published a number of book chapters and articles on this. And right now I'm editing a new book, and it's going to have 3 chapters that focus on domestic violence in child custody cases. So where I'm at now in terms of research is, I think the most exciting research right now, as far as I'm concerned, with respect to the family court and domestic violence, is in terms of the issue of coercive control. So over the years, as I've just explained, there's been a gender bias in the family court system, at least here in Northern California. Now, I've heard anecdotally that in some states, the judges favor the dads. I don't know if that's true or not. I can't say for sure. I can tell you that in the San Francisco Bay Area, the judges are reasonably fair to dads' rights compared to some of the horror stories I've heard about other states. But all I can say is what I know, what I've experienced, and what I've researched. But one of the truisms, or assumed truisms, we call the gender paradigm, is this assumption that domestic violence is about female victims and male perpetrators. So over the years, the gender paradigm adherents have tried to make us believe that only men are violent physically. And when women are violent, it's in self-defense. That has morphed, that has changed. There's been overwhelming amount of evidence over the years to show otherwise. And even organizations like AFCC and judicial councils around the country are admitting that women can be violent as well. They also initiate the violence. But the so-called gender paradigm has morphed now to where the new new accepted line is that that well, women can be violent, but they're not controlling, or they're not as controlling as men, which of course is nonsense. If you're a researcher, you know this is absolute nonsense. But this is where we are. So in California, last year or 2 years ago, a new law was passed and was passed by the legislature and signed by the governor that would allow litigants in the family court system to more easily get restraining orders based on a presumption that the partner was exercising coercive control. So you can get a restraining order not just based on threats of physical violence or actual physical violence and actual fear of violence, but if you could show that the other person has been doing coercive things like spying on you, or making veiled threats, or trying to control the money and so forth. So and this really got my attention because to me that's a slippery slope. It's very, very hard. It's hard to prove that there's been physical violence when domestic violence is a family matter, and it's often not observed by anyone. There are often no witnesses. It's often he said, she said. But now, if you're throwing in psychological abuse into the mix, nothing wrong per se about including psychological abuse as one of those considerations, because children can be really affected if the parents are, a dad who's extremely controlling of mom is a terrible role model. His behavior is not only affecting mom psychologically, but affecting the kids indirectly by causing mom distress. It potentially lowers mom's ability to parent the children and to cope. So theoretically, I think it's a good thing that we're asked to look at not just physical aggression in relationships, but also psychological abuse. But the research shows that it's really, there's a big difference between actual psychological abuse and simple arguments. And as a forensic social worker, and having worked in a lot of these cases, I can tell you that much of the time, a plaintiff will accuse, and it's almost always women who do so. Men do it too, but in my experience, it's been mostly women who will say, he's highly controlling. He's engaged in controlling coercive violence. The attorneys know how to get their clients to frame this so that it meets up with the legal requirements for these definitions. And they use terms that were initially advanced by a guy by the name of Michael Johnson. Michael Johnson came up with this typology of domestic violence where he separated regular couples conflict that escalates. He calls that situational couples violence versus true battering, what he calls controlling coercive violence, and which is reasonably true. I mean, it is a distinction that can be made. The problem is that everyone's trying to fit any kind of argument between a man and a wife. If the husband says, I don't want you going to Tahiti, it's going to cost us too much money. And she says, I want to be with my sisters. And he goes, well, we can't afford it. Then he's controlling her. So I run into this all the time. I get these cases where, and sometimes these cases where I'm asked to work with the attorney for the female plaintiff. And I always, before I take on a case, I always make sure to tell them that, well, I can only help you if you have a strong case, And I'd say half the time, I have to say to them, well, you have a weak case. You're claiming, your client is claiming that the husband is highly controlling, but in reality, I'm not seeing that. He's not threatening to kill her. He's not like threatening to take the money. He makes some threats, like, if you um, if you buy a new car we can't afford, I'm gonna have to cut up the credit cards. Well, that's just good fiscal management as far as I'm concerned. It's limit setting, right? I'm not exaggerating. I'm telling you that I get a lot of cases like that. And so I've thought a lot about how to deal with that. On the one hand, we don't want kids exposed to an environment where either parent is either physically or psychologically abusive to the other parent. I don't want to minimize the impact that psychological abuse does have and coercive control. The problem is that uh, it's been the findings have been twisted in such a way that most people now believe that it's only men that can engage in controlling a coercive violence. Uh, so my part of my job as a forensic expert witness is to clarify these things. What I'll point out is that there is one area where men clearly have an advantage. It's because of their size and strength. Men are, on average, better able to back up their threats and their controlling behaviors with physical violence. So men and women are just as likely to try to control one another. Women are just as controlling as men on every measure that's ever been used. Modern measures that with construct validity uh, and convergent validity that have shown over and over again. Women are just as jealous, just as possessive. Just they make the same kind of threats. They carry out the threats. The main difference is that men are at an extreme level where men are much more dangerous. That's why you have 3/4 of intimate partner homicide victims are women, right? So at high levels where the guy really loses it, the guy is more dangerous. Men are just more dangerous in general. Um, so it's not that women aren't controlling or aren't trying to control. They're just as malevolent or can be as men. It's just that they're not physically able to uh, to enforce their will the way some men can. The problem is that that kind of violence, that extreme level of violence, which we sometimes is called intimate terrorism, is very, very small proportion of the cases that are out there. Very, very small proportion. But the attorneys frame it as though every single case is like that. So every woman who wants custody of the children, whose husband may have grabbed her, 3 years ago, is a victim of controlling coercive violence. And this is the problem. The problem isn't that women aren't more in danger of being killed or severely injured. We know that. The problem is that the statistics are manipulated to try to show that all women are experiencing this, right? What's the new research that I find it really be exciting is some research that's been done by Jennifer Harman and her colleagues, showing Edward Cook, showing that really, if you think of domestic violence as on the same continuum as child abuse and parental alienation, then it sort of kind of clears the air, because we have this unnecessary division amongst family court experts, where on one side, the the people that are trying to help dads get custody of their children are going to emphasize how much there's parental alienation going on. And on the other side, the battered women's activists will say, well, the real problem is these men are violent, and they're using parental alienation claims just as a diversion, as a way to get custody of the kids when they're really, in fact, violent. Well, what we're finding, what Jennifer and I and others are finding, is that, in fact, we're all talking about the same thing. We're talking about the extent to which parents want to manipulate the system and to control their partners in order to get their kids. It's really that simple. Wanting to the parental instinct is a very, very strong instinct in human beings. One that, along with the self-preservation instinct, it's one of the strongest instincts we have.
We've heard over and over again how there just is not balance within the family court system, and how the conflict that's created in family court often makes these situations worse. And it certainly doesn't help when the lawyers will take situation which may be isolated or is the first time that something's happened, and then they want to obviously use that to their advantage. So they try and make it as big of a deal as possible. But I mean, you've been studying this stuff for a long time. How do we get the system to be more balanced? How do we get the system to be more fair? And what's your take on how things have been trending?
Well, I mean, I would say one of the key changes that's going to have to be made is it's with education. We need to educate uh, the all these players in the family court system. I've been trying to do that. I'm amazed at how incredibly ignorant a lot of attorneys are about domestic violence. And attorneys are among the most open-minded people because they have no. I mean, they just need to win cases. So, they have
Right.
no ideological axe to grind. So
Yeah.
I find them refreshingly open-minded. But it's amazing to me how, I mean, they pay me a lot of money to just basically explain to them some simple facts.
So, one thing we've seen in the family court system is that there's a very large reward for the outcome of these cases, right? And there's relatively little penalty, if any, to say whatever you need to do to get that reward, right?
Yeah.
And we're talking about both males and females here, and so. I think we've seen across the country there's very little effort within the court system to penalize people who lie, who make false claims, those sorts of things. And how does that play into the family violence? And I mean, is it a cause of family violence? Is it something that could reduce family violence if courts were to take the responsibility and keep litigants honest per se? What's your take on that?
Well, yeah, I yes, of course that would be great, but there's a couple of problems here. Uh, Defining domestic violence and figure out who's lying, who's telling the truth is really problematic. So, how's the court going to determine that someone is deliberately lying as opposed to maybe just exaggerating? That's a problem in itself. Um, but earlier, I was telling you that this new conception of of psychological aggression, physical aggression against partners, aggression towards the children, and parental alienation should all be considered part of what we call family abuse. So, in that sense, there's something called legal and administrative abuse, LA for short. Legal and administrative abuse is a form of coercive control that that involves calling the police to get somebody in trouble. It can include threatening to report someone to welfare or to have them deported. It's where you use the legal system in a way to get an advantage over your partner. And so, one of the first organizations to identify controlling behaviors by men was the Domestic Abuse Intervention Project in Duluth, Minnesota. These are the people that came up with the Duluth model of treatment, if you've heard of that, and the power and control wheel. And if you've ever seen a power and control wheel, it visually shows different ways that men control their partners. One of the one of the little pie pieces of pie on the pie chart is using children and using the system, right? So we've battered women's advocates for many, 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 many years. I pointed out how men are able to use the system. Well, women use the system. Interestingly, when men complain in court that their the mother is abusing the system, they're accused of being in denial, but they're not. I mean, women abuse the system just the way men do. I don't know if women abuse the system more. They might. One theory is that they abuse the system more because the system is sort of geared to believe them. So I think that's a hypothesis that needs to be tested out. But we can at least agree that both males and females can abuse the system. So, but if we think of legal and administrative abuse as part of controlling coercive abuse, then it can be taken more seriously. What I'm saying is the system is primed right now especially right now, because of the efforts of battered women's advocates, to take seriously psychological abuse, coercive controlling behaviors by men. If we can show that women do the same things and that legal and administrative abuse is part of that coercive control, then perhaps uh, anyone that's using that will be held accountable. I think that's one way to that's in my opinion, that's probably the best way to handle it. It's like, well, okay, instead of, we agree, men can be very controlling. We agree with the power and control wheel. But here's some research showing that women do the same thing. And here's some more research showing that men and women also use the legal system as a way of controlling one another. And I think that that would be more successful in, so we take existing opinions and assumptions about domestic violence and then expand on them and become more inclusive, as opposed to opposing claims that all dads are violent with, well, moms are just alienating. That's not a good counter. It guarantees constant political fighting that will never end. So ultimately, we want to marginalize the crazies, the insane, some of those insane people that make statements like women aren't controlling, just insane statements like that. We want to marginalize them to the point where they become laughing stocks and are just not even given any serious consideration, as opposed to right now where they're given complete consideration. I go in when I do forensic work, I often will be able to read the reports by the expert on the other side. Unbelievable. The experts on the so-called experts on domestic violence will cite studies from 40 years ago that I know have been disproved long since. And the attorneys and the judges don't know the difference. They don't know. I mean, if I wasn't around to point out that this is bogus or that these studies are either no longer relevant, or the findings were taken out of context or otherwise manipulated, then no one would know. So we need to have more educated experts like myself. A lot of us are in academia. I'm not in academia, but most of the people that are knowledgeable about domestic violence are in academia, unfortunately. So they don't necessarily always have access to the court system. And I have talked to numerous highly respected individuals in the family court system, experts. I'm not going to mention names, but experts who have been writing about this for years and years. And, I think they're just as concerned. I mean, some of them are more likely to err on the side of the battered women's perspective. But even some of those individuals really are trying to, do what's right for children. And they're open to learning. Politics keeps them sometimes from saying what they really want to say. So I go to these conferences and there's a lot of hedging around, very few people are as direct about it as I am. But I think overall it's getting better. I think it's getting better since the mid 1990s. I think the information is getting out there. So I think things are getting better, but I don't know how much better it's gonna be.
Well, and so if somebody is facing this sort of issue where they're being falsely accused, or maybe things are blown out of proportion, what's your advice? What can they do? Is the best thing for their attorney to find an expert like you to come
Yeah,
onto the case? What's your general advice there?
yeah, yes. They should find an expert like me. Um, there's a website that I established many years ago, domesticviolenceresearch.org, domesticviolenceresearch.org. Um, and I established that website for the express purpose of making available the most recent research on domestic violence. So there's thousands of pages of research that's available. And also, I have a list of about 50 or 60 domestic violence experts around the country who are very knowledgeable about domestic violence. Not all of them do expert witness work, but many of them do. So if somebody is looking for an expert witness on domestic violence, they can certainly go to one thing they can do is they can go to attorney directories. There are like SEAK, Seek, or ALM, or attorney directories where an individual can find experts that like myself. But that's one way to try to get an expert. Most of the experts out there are going to take the gender paradigm view, but not all of them. They may do that because they mostly get battered women as clients, but some of them may be very open to working with someone who's falsely accused. The people at domesticviolenceresearch.org, those individuals, I feel safe recommending them because they are very knowledgeable about domestic violence. So if to the extent that they're doing forensic work, they might be very helpful.
Well, we're about out of time. I really want to thank you for coming on today. And can you tell us, is there a place where people can reach you at? Do you have a website and social media, that sort of stuff?
Well, I'm not on social media. Yeah, you can go to my website, johnhamel.net, JOHNHAM as in Mary, EL, johnhamel.net. I've got some satellite websites. I mentioned one of them, domesticviolenceresearch.org, a couple of other websites. I have online anger management classes. You've been court referred to do an anger management class, and you can do it online. I have those at a reasonable price. I have trainings for professionals that are also online. But if you're wanting to just get some information from me, you have some questions, or you'd like some journal articles or book chapters on a particular topic of interest to you, I'll send them to you for free.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us today. And we look forward to reading more about your book here in the future.
Thank you for inviting me. Appreciate it.